In 1845, a coal-dependent village in Pennsylvania ceased its industrial pursuit and began excavating for something entirely impossible. The residents believed they had stumbled upon a natural hollow, but what emerged from the soil was no typical cave. It was constructed half-submerged in silt, layered in grime, and etched with an incomprehensible accuracy. There stood a pyramid, inverted, its apex driven deep into the crust, as though the planet itself were attempting to conceal its presence. The laborers referred to it as the geometry beneath, while the authorities labeled the site classified. Following that year, the village of Daquan, Pennsylvania, was struck from every official record. But what was the reason? What did they exhume from that earth that required eternal burial? Examine this image with care, because what is being revealed defies reality. Enter the darkness. Follow us now and remain until the conclusion, because in this narrative, the final revelation alters every preceding fact. The correspondence was unearthed in 1911, tucked inside a corroded metal container and trapped under the ruined tunnels of the Daquan mine. Its author, Inspector Nathaniel Greaves, was last spotted on the dawn of October 12, 1843, the precise day the excavation crew hit what he categorized simply as a deviant design in the ground. The script wavers and the pigment absorbed irregularly into the parchment, suggesting it was composed in a subterranean crawl space by the flicker of a flame. "We have located an edifice, sir. It is not a feature of this mine. The crew claims the rock is breathing." N. Greaves. October 11, 1843. The account originates in the ridges of Carbon County, Pennsylvania, where the Daquan mining operation had commenced a fresh coal extraction 3 miles east of the settlement. The passageway was cramped, hardly spacious enough for 3 workers side by side, and the atmosphere was so heavy with debris that lights seemed to choke mid-flicker. However, that specific morning, a vibration reverberated through the shafts that no hand tool could produce. A deep, metallic chime, rhythmic and intentional. Once the haze settled, the crew observed a level, dark surface cutting through the rock face, polished, freezing to the touch, and engraved. Greaves was summoned from the surface post to examine the find. Bystanders reported that he bowed before the object, clearing away the coal dust with the side of his mitt. "It is merely shale," one worker murmured. Greaves signaled his disagreement. Not slate, but something much more ancient. Under the glow of the lanterns, delicate etchings surfaced, geometric strokes creating flawless corners, a symmetry far too precise to be a mere accident. It was a triangle inverted into the earth itself. That night, Greaves climbed back to the surface to dispatch his findings to Harrisburg. The site foreman later provided testimony that the inspector appeared fundamentally altered, his gaze drifting, his speech abrupt, and his fingers gripping a folded document as if the parchment were scorching his flesh. In his ultimate message, composed only moments before his disappearance, Greaves detailed the experience of standing in the tunnel while the walls vibrated with a low drone. He mentioned the workers descending a light into the fresh breach. The wick's fire curved inward, dragged by an unseen force. "It was not a cavern we exposed," his correspondence finished. "It was manufactured." The next dawn, the laborers came back, only to find the breach completely closed. There were no shards of stone and no rubble, only a level, dark mineral chilled to the touch, as if the soil had mended its own wounds during the night. Greaves had evaporated. His workspace remained untouched, his blankets messy. Only his jacket was left behind, draped near the entrance and coated in a dark soot. The document concludes with one solitary broken line. A phrase halted in the middle of a word, as though the pigment had simply vanished. The design persists toward the depths and under it. The metal container holding his words was recovered many years later during a clandestine dig. Within it were remnants of crimson clay and grime, along with the ghost of a triangular shape stamped into the iron cover. Even today it remains a mystery how a mid-19th century official could have illustrated with such clarity the exact dimensions of an inverted pyramid, a monument he did not survive to see fully unearthed. Whatever was discovered in 1843 was not a natural part of the world. It was a presence waiting to be found. Declassified was nestled silently within the creases of the Pennsylvania mining district, a settlement that was seldom noted on geographical records, even during its existence. It was a location defined by cramped lanes and a stern, chilling devotion where the parish chimes announced every sunrise before the initial drop into the pits. The year was 1843, and almost every household in Declassified relied on the ground under their feet, a ground that had started to murmur. Local legends suggested the village was constructed on land that did not belong to them, claiming the original pioneers stumbled upon vestiges of something more ancient under the rock. Cultivators spoke of peculiar rocks dug up during the harvest, each etched with light geometric slopes they could not clarify. Regardless, they established their residences. By the era the extraction firm arrived, the old tales had been forgotten, or perhaps people simply chose to ignore them. The residents of the settlement were pragmatic people. They gauged value by the tonnage of coal and the attendance at Sunday service, but law traveled much quicker than the industrial carts. When Inspector Greaves dissipated, a chill swept through the local tavern that evening. Certain individuals argued he had been flattened by a structural failure. Others whispered that he had pursued the resonance deep under the mine, descending into the abyss by choice. In the ensuing weeks, the tunnel mouth was obstructed with timber. The corporation dismissed this as a standard security measure. However, every night, workers heading home insisted they could still perceive the chime. The same metallic vibration Greaves had detailed in his correspondence, low, steady, and emerging from under the planks. Existence in Declassified began to distort around that singular resonance. Laborers declined to work anywhere near the barricaded shaft. The parish shifted its evening liturgy to the morning hours to deny the darkness its influence. Parents prohibited their offspring from sketching patterns in the grime. Nevertheless, the emblem persisted. Triangles were found etched into boundary fences, chalked onto classroom furniture, and drawn by wandering fingers into the mist on glass panes, invariably inverted, invariably directed toward the core of the earth. The postmaster, among the few educated residents, received a delivery intended for Greaves 14 days after his vanishing. Within the wrapping was a lone leaf of parchment, void of text save for a tiny dark triangle scorched into the midpoint. There was no script and no official mark. The pigment had corroded the paper like a caustic chemical. Whispers started to emerge that the mine's financiers, a consortium from Boston, maintained connections to secret societies. Their financial records contained anonymous transfers categorized simply as structural advice. No one could identify the designer. No one ever authorized the technical drawings. By the frost of winter, the children of the laborers had started to walk in their sleep. They were discovered in the lanes after midnight, standing in clusters and gazing toward the barricaded mine mouth. When asked for an explanation, they all repeated a haunting phrase: "It is summoning the world home." The following thaw, the corporation revealed intentions to unseal the passage under a different leadership. The aged timber was stripped away. Underneath, the floor was flawlessly level, appearing as though it had been polished. There was no rubble and no evidence of a cave-in, only a void that stood in anticipation. And when the initial team went down to examine it, they detailed a find even more peculiar. The atmosphere in the depths was freezing, but it carried the slight scent of burning wax, as if a presence had recently vacated the area. When the crew reopened the shaft in the spring of 1844, they encountered an atmosphere that was unnaturally stagnant. Even the resonance of their boots against the ladder rungs seemed to evaporate a few feet below the surface. They carried lanterns, the flames trembling as if sensing the profound cold waiting in the depths. The foreman, a man named Kavanaugh, was the first to enter the chamber Greaves had detailed in his final correspondence, and the sight would later haunt every man who followed. The walls were smooth to an impossible degree, resembling glass poured into the shape of stone. Every few feet, a groove ran diagonally upward, all converging into a single point far above their heads. It took time for the men to comprehend the reality of their surroundings. The mine wasn't a tunnel at all. It was the upper tip of a structure buried upside down, carved with mathematical precision, a pyramid inverted into the bedrock. Kavanaugh ordered the men to clear the surrounding debris. With each strike of their pickaxes, the echoes grew sharper and cleaner, as if striking a hollow vessel. One miner swore he heard the sound returning seconds later, as if something within the structure was mimicking the rhythm. By midday, they had revealed a section of wall large enough to sketch. The foreman's rough drawings, later retrieved from the company's archives, showed angles of exactly identical to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Yet, the composition was unlike any known geological material. A visiting geologist, Professor Lamb from the University of Philadelphia, described it as black limestone with ferrous impurities. However, his assistant noted a detail Lamb omitted from the report. The fragments they collected dissolved overnight, leaving behind only a fine grey dust. The professor dismissed this as a simple reaction to moisture, but the miners were less certain. One of them whispered that the stone didn't want to be removed. Over the next week, more unsettling details emerged. The walls were lined with faint markings, not hieroglyphs, but shallow depressions arranged in repeating groups of 7. The grooves formed what looked like stair steps, yet none were large enough for a human foot. When sunlight was reflected down the shaft using a system of mirrors, the markings glimmered faintly, like veins of metal catching the light. Rumors spread that the pattern continued far below the pit's current base. Kavanaugh forbade further digging until company inspectors arrived, but the men worked by candlelight after hours, driven by a strange compulsion to expose more. Several claimed the angles seemed to shift as they carved, as if the geometry itself resisted being measured. One miner, Thomas Hall, began keeping a private journal. He wrote that while sketching the inner wall, he noticed his ruler had warped, the straight edge curving slightly inward, matching the pyramid's contour. His final entry reads, "No man can measure what is already perfect." Hall disappeared 2 nights later. His lantern was found extinguished at the bottom of the shaft, resting upright. By midsummer, the company announced a halt to all operations. The structure was to be sealed again, pending federal review. But Kavanaugh's last letter to his wife suggests otherwise. "It isn't solid stone," he wrote. "It feels hollow. When the picks strike deep enough, something moves behind the wall like pressure, like breath." The miners didn't argue when he ordered the exit boarded. They didn't even look back. Yet, before the boards went up, one man marked the wall with a final stroke of chalk, tracing the outline of the triangle they'd uncovered. In the flicker of the last lantern, the mark appeared to glow, faintly alive, before fading back into the dark. The company sent 3 men down to study what the miners had found. All were professionals, engineers from Philadelphia, educated, skeptical, the sort who measured belief by the inch. Their names were recorded once in the payroll ledger dated June 1844, James Weller, Samuel Pike, and Elias Hart. After that, no further entries were made beside their names, only the word "closed." On the morning of their descent, witnesses described them lowering their instruments by rope, surveying chains, compasses, and theodolites, and laughing at the miners who crossed themselves as the cage door shut. By midday, the mine had fallen silent. The rope, when pulled, came back slack. At dusk, Kavanaugh ordered a retrieval. He and 2 volunteers went down as far as the pulley would take them, shouting into the dark. They heard nothing but a slow, rhythmic echo like dripping water. When they reached the base of the shaft, the lantern light caught something metallic glinting at their feet. 3 notebooks, neatly stacked, bound with twine. No dust, no sign of struggle, no footprints, just the books. And beside them, a length of rope cut clean through as if by a blade. The first notebook belonged to Weller. Its pages contained precise sketches of the inverted walls, the measurements growing smaller and denser toward the end until they formed a single black triangle filling the page. The second, Pike's, contained lists of figures and a phrase repeated several times in his hand, angle constant, depth changing. The third was Hart's. A few pages of rough notes and a final entry written sideways along the margin. We are beneath the lowest point, and yet it goes further down. A second search found only their abandoned tools. One compass spun endlessly even above ground as though something inside it had broken loose. The company sealed the shaft again, citing structural instability. The town was told the engineers had relocated after the project's closure, but rumors traveled faster than the official reports. Miners whispered that the three men had found a chamber below the visible structure, a hollow filled with fine grey dust that shifted as they walked, as if alive. One claimed to have seen light flicker through the boards that night, pale blue, pulsing like breath. Weeks later, the company received a package without return address. Inside were 3 miners' tags, small brass discs engraved with the missing men's initials, each bent sharply in half. There was no note. Kavanaugh kept the notebooks locked in his office. He told no one he had begun to dream of descending stairs made of black stone, each step reflecting his lantern light back into his eyes. The dreams grew so vivid that one morning he walked to the mine entrance still wearing his nightshirt. His wife found him standing before the sealed boards, his hands pressed against the wood, whispering to someone below. He left town the next day and was never seen again. The boards stayed nailed shut for 5 years until the next foreman arrived, bringing new men, new drills, and the same old question: what had the engineers found in the dark? By the summer of 1845, the company reopened the site for a limited inspection. The official reason was to assess mineral potential. Unofficially, it was to retrieve the notebooks that Kavanaugh had left behind. New management claimed the previous disasters were exaggerations of frightened men. But when the first crew descended, they found something no report could have prepared them for. The boards sealing the shaft were still in place, yet the ground beneath had shifted. Where the last inspection showed smooth rock, there now stood a single block, black, polished, its edges exact. It protruded from the earth like the tip of an uncut monument. At its center was an engraved mark, faintly visible under lantern light, a triangle within a circle, its apex pointed down. The men called it the capstone, though it sat at the mine's deepest point. When touched, the surface was warm. One worker, Joseph Mays, claimed it pulsed under his palm as if something inside were breathing. The others laughed, but none touched it again. They sent for the local pastor to examine the markings, thinking them some form of Masonic script. Reverend Alan Burke arrived with his Bible and a magnifying lens, insisting there was nothing unholy about geometry. Yet when he saw the symbol, his color drained. He traced the lines with his gloved finger, then stepped back and refused to enter the shaft again. That night, he burned his gloves in the churchyard fire. The following morning, Mays arrived at work shirtless, the same triangle carved into his chest with a miner's knife. He said it protected the breath of the earth. When questioned, he couldn't explain what he meant. His wound never healed properly. By autumn, he was gone, last seen walking toward the river, carrying his lamp. The miners began finding smaller carvings etched into their tools, scratched into coal carts, sometimes appearing overnight in the dust of the tunnels, always the same shape. A few men claimed to hear faint chanting beneath the sound of dripping water, syllables too low to be words. Those who heard it longest said the noise came from inside their skulls. Company officials ordered the capstone covered in tar and sealed behind a wooden barrier. The men complied, but complained the sound grew worse afterward, the humming constant now, like a hidden bell. Reverend Burke left town soon after, leaving behind a sermon draft found years later in the rectory drawer. If the Lord's house is built upon the rock, then what lies beneath that rock is not of him. Beware the worship of perfect angles. They bow to no God. 2 months later, miners discovered that the tar covering had cracked open in a perfect triangle. The boards were splintered outward as if something beneath had pressed against them. None of the men would enter the shaft after that. The company suspended operations indefinitely. Years later, when surveyors mapped the old mine for closure, they noted that the capstone was no longer visible. In its place was a flat, smooth floor, untouched, unbroken, as though the block had been drawn back into the earth. The last line of the surveyor's report reads simply, "Symbol absent, surface breathing faintly." By winter of 1845, the mine stood abandoned, its entrance boarded once more, the tools left to rust under frost. Yet the people of Daquan could not leave it alone. A strange comfort had begun to grow among them, a need to gather near the sealed earth to listen. The townsfolk said the mine no longer echoed like a hollow chamber, but sang low and steady like a choir too far below to see. It began with the miners' widows. They visited the site at night, carrying candles down the valley path, lighting them before the wooden planks that sealed the shaft. They knelt in silence, whispering the names of the missing, believing perhaps their husbands could still hear. Then, in early spring, the church bell began to toll without anyone pulling its rope. Father Ellison insisted it was only the wind, but he stopped opening the church after dusk. Within weeks, the gatherings grew larger. Men and women came at midnight, forming a circle around the mine. Some brought hymn books, others tools from the old tunnels, symbols of the work that had fed the town. They sang hymns at first, familiar, harmless songs. Then the words began to change. People claimed they didn't remember what they'd sung, only that the notes vibrated in their chests long after the music stopped. Children woke in the night, muttering those same syllables. A schoolteacher, Miss Dana, wrote in her journal that her pupils had begun carving small triangles into their desks with slate pencils, as though rehearsing some lesson they were never taught. By midsummer, the gatherings moved underground. A farmer, John Ridge, cut an entry into one of the old ventilation tunnels. He found a hollow carved perfectly beneath the chapel, mirroring its shape. There were candle stubs melted into the stone and footprints circling what appeared to be an altar, flat black, with a single symbol cut deep into its surface. No one ever admitted to holding services there, yet the records tell otherwise. In the church ledger, 4 pages written in Father Ellison's hand bear the same closing line, "Prayer offered to the geometry beneath." The handwriting grows more hurried with each entry until the last, where ink trails into a black smear. The following week, half the town attended Sunday Mass, dressed in their work clothes. The sermon lasted only 15 minutes. No one spoke after the bell tolled once as the doors were locked. That night, a traveler passing through reported seeing light flickering beneath the church floorboards, a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of a human heartbeat. When the sheriff arrived 2 days later, he found the chapel empty. The pews were overturned, the altar missing, the hymn books burned to ash. The only mark on the floor was the same triangle found deep below the mine, its point driven downward, carved as if by many hands. From that night on, the valley went silent. No birds, no bells, only the faint hum of air rising from beneath the ground, as if the earth itself had learned to breathe. In November of 1845, the Federal Office of Mines sent a new team to Daquan. Rumors of disappearances and a town falling into superstition had reached the capital. The officials arrived expecting hysteria, not architecture. They brought engineers, surveyors, and a detachment of soldiers to keep order, reopen the mine, document what was found, and confirm the existence of any man-made structure below. The team reached the lowest chamber after 3 days of clearing debris. The air was heavy and cold, but there was no smell of decay, only a sterile dryness like air sealed for centuries. The instruments behaved erratically. Compass needles spun, pendulums would not settle. One engineer, Callahan, recorded that his voice echoed 3 times, each one returning slightly delayed, as though the chamber itself spoke after him. When the dust cleared, they realized they were standing inside an inverted pyramid, a hollow that widened as it descended. The walls met at precise, impossible angles, each plane polished until it reflected their lamps in distorted fragments. They climbed downward along the sloping stone, their lights glimmering across the black surfaces. The deeper they went, the louder the vibration became, a faint, throbbing pulse that could be felt in the ribs. At the center of the structure, there was a hollow shaft running even deeper. When one of the soldiers dropped a stone into it, the sound never returned. Callahan's report described the shaft as a throat cut into the rock, designed to swallow sound and light alike. That night, the men camped inside the chamber. They claimed the air shifted, carrying whispers that moved from corner to corner. One soldier swore he saw movement beneath the stone surface, slow undulations, as if the walls themselves were breathing. By dawn, they had discovered carvings, lines forming a series of nested triangles, each one inverted within the next. It was geometry within geometry. One of the surveyors calculated that if continued, the final point would vanish into something smaller than a grain of sand. The report sent to Harrisburg included a single sketch labeled Sectional View, Structure Below Daquan. It showed a pyramid turned upside down, its apex piercing into a circular void. When they sealed the chamber again, the miners said the ground exhaled, a gust of wind so cold it extinguished every lantern. By early 1846, the mine stood under government seal. Officially, the chamber was declared unstable. Unofficially, no one could explain why the ground itself had begun to shift. The collapse came without warning on February 17th at 3 in the morning. A tremor rolled through the town. Witnesses said it sounded not like thunder, but like a deep, drawn-out sigh from below. Within minutes, the central street began to buckle. Fissures spread outward in perfect symmetry, forming the outline of a triangle nearly 40 yards wide. Then the ground fell inward. The mine swallowed 42 men. Not one body was recovered. A woman named Lydia Cobb later told investigators she had seen light pour upward from the earth as it caved, a cold blue glow that bent the air around it. When officials surveyed the crater, they found that the debris formed a precise shape, the triangle once again inverted, its angles aligned to the cardinal points. Callahan returned from Harrisburg to supervise the recovery. His notes read, "The structure did not collapse. It folded itself shut. There is intelligence in its design. It breathes still, though buried." Excavation efforts failed. Each time they dug, new layers slid inward as though resisting exposure. Shovels bent, carts overturned, lanterns died without smoke. A week later, Callahan ordered a final attempt. They drove timbers deep into the crater for stability and lowered ropes between them. The first man who descended shouted that the walls below were smooth again. Then the rope jerked and went slack. It came up clean, no blood, no torn fibers, as if it had passed through air. The site was filled with gravel and sealed with stone. The official report labeled it a geological event. The government men left, but Daquan did not recover. Half the town moved away, leaving doors unlatched. Those who stayed said the nights had grown too quiet. Years later, farmers claimed that after heavy rain, the soil sank slightly near the old pit, drawing down in 3 sharp lines forming a triangle. By 1850, the town was renamed New Daquan. Houses were rebuilt on the higher ridge, and the old crater was paved into Founders Square. Beneath that square lay the 42 men, their deaths attributed to a mine collapse of indeterminate cause. The new settlers arrived with optimism, yet the census records from 1850 show something inexplicable. The town's population had doubled, though no new families were recorded arriving. One note in the ledger reads, "Many names repeated, though no duplicate persons found." The newcomers were indistinguishable from those who had left. Same surnames, same faces. A miner named Enoch Dale returned to his home and found another man living there with his wife, a man who claimed to be Enoch Dale as well. The townspeople began calling them First Dale and Second Dale. Both vanished together the following winter. At night, residents heard rhythmic knocks beneath their floors. Children drew triangles nested inside one another. "It's what the earth remembers," they said. In 1851, the schoolteacher compiled Lessons from the Hollow, where a child wrote, "The town under the town is still building." During the construction of a monument in the square, masons uncovered a layer of black limestone, perfectly smooth. When sunlight hit it, the surface shimmered as if alive. They paved over it and told no one. By autumn, a fine tremor ran through the ground each night. The mayor's final letter stated, "We built over the old earth, yet it builds still beneath us. The soil moves when it sleeps." No further correspondence followed. Though records list New Daquan as thriving through the 1850s, not a single photograph exists. Only the foundation stones remain today, forming the faint outline of a triangle. By 1853, people had grown used to the tremors and the hum. They no longer spoke of it, but the chalk triangles filled the blackboards each morning before lessons. The lines were too perfect for a child's hand. Miss Harlow, the school mistress, recorded these events until her own records ceased in 1855, leaving the mystery of the geometry beneath to the silence of the Pennsylvania soil. Miss Harlow attempted to remove the marks, yet they reappeared the following day, carved more profoundly into the slate and faintly etched as if with a blade. One evening, she remained behind to catch the culprit. By lamplight, she observed a student, 10-year-old Clara Wells, rise from her seat and trace invisible lines in the air before the chalk began to move independently. When Miss Harlow called out, Clara turned. Her eyes were open, but she remained asleep. The next morning, Clara remembered nothing. Yet when asked why she drew the triangles, she whispered, "It is how the ground looks when it dreams." Soon, every child in the town began sketching the same forms on windows, in dust, and even on their own skin. Parents scrubbed the marks off only to find them again the next day. Some said the children spoke to one another in whispers that were not words, a rhythm of humming and breath. At night, candles in their bedrooms flickered in unison, the flames bending inward as though towards some unseen current. Doctors from the nearby city came to study what they called collective somnambulism. They interviewed the children and asked them to redraw what they had seen. The sketches they produced showed the same structure, layer upon layer of inverted triangles descending into darkness. When arranged together, the drawings formed a larger pattern that matched the precise dimensions recorded in Callahan's Forbidden Survey 8 years earlier. One physician, Dr. Harlan Coe, wrote in his notes that the children's pulse quickened whenever they held a compass, as though their hearts beat to the rhythm of magnetic north. He burned his notes before leaving town, but his assistant later recalled a single phrase scrawled across the last page. "The pattern remembers itself." As weeks passed, the drawings became more elaborate. Some children began digging small holes in their yards, always triangular and always to the same depth. They filled them with pebbles and left them uncovered, claiming it helped them breathe better at night. When parents filled the holes, the children wept until the next dawn. On the evening of March 12th, a storm rolled through the valley. Lightning struck the schoolhouse roof, splitting it open. Amid the rain and ash, the remaining walls stood scorched with a single black mark. An inverted pyramid burned clean through the wood. The children were found huddled together inside, uninjured but silent, staring upward through the broken ceiling. Miss Harlow said they were watching the sky as if it were the floor of some deeper place. That night, she wrote one final entry in her journal before leaving New Daquan forever. "They say children see heaven first, but I think they see what waits beneath it." For more than 20 years, the ground of New Daquan remained sealed. The mine had been declared a sacred hazard, off limits to prospectors and engineers alike. Yet in 1871, a new mining syndicate purchased the land under a false name, claiming they sought to reopen the coal veins. They called themselves the Hollow Ridge Company, though no records of its incorporation were ever found. The first men who arrived in town wore uniforms without insignia. They carried no Bibles, only instruments of measure and a single map marked with an inverted triangle. By the second week of July, drilling had begun again. The workers reported that the soil beneath the old square was unlike any other in the region, dense, almost metallic, and producing sparks when struck by iron tools. On the fourth day, their drills pierced through a hollow space. A rush of cold air escaped, carrying a smell like iron and rain-soaked stone. The foreman, Elias Grant, noted in his field log that the air seemed to move with intention, as though drawn toward the living. The company's first report to Harrisburg described an architectural anomaly 20 feet below the surface, a series of chambers descending in precise geometric patterns, smaller and smaller toward the bottom. Each layer mirrored the last, forming a perfect nesting of pyramids inverted within one another. Grant compared it to a reflection repeating itself in dark glass. As they dug deeper, the vibrations returned. The miners called it the heartbeat. No one could locate its source. It pulsed through rock, through tools, and through their own chests. The men began working in silence, timing their strikes to match the rhythm. One evening, a surveyor noticed their picks hitting stone in unison, perfectly synchronized, though no one had spoken. He left the site that night and never came back. By August, they reached a black limestone slab. Unlike the rest, when tapped, it rang like hollow iron. The engineers removed a small section and peered inside. What they saw was recorded only once in a report now missing from federal archives. But a surviving letter from one of the contractors describes it in 4 words: a structure within motion. Soon after, the drilling ceased. The workers began collapsing. They were not injured but unresponsive, standing upright with their eyes open, breathing in rhythm with the pulse beneath the ground. Grant wrote that he tried to wake them, shouting into their faces, but their bodies swayed gently like trees in a wind that no one else could feel. The excavation ended abruptly on September 3rd, when a tremor split the central pit. A column of light, pale and blue, rose for a moment and then vanished, leaving the tools melted into the ground. The remaining men filled the hole with soil and fled. A government delegation arrived weeks later, sealing the valley once again. The Hollow Ridge Company dissolved without a trace, its investors never identified. In the State Archive, a single memorandum survives from that year, unsigned and half-burned. It reads, "Do not disturb the layers. They are closing themselves. Every smaller pyramid beats faster than the one before." After 1871, the tremors ceased and the hum was gone. But those who lived nearby said the silence felt heavier, as though the earth below had finally begun to sleep. When the government sealed New Daquan for the second time, only one official record of the 1871 excavation was ever completed. It bore the title, Survey Report, Subterranean Structure Below Carbon Valley, and it was signed by a name long presumed dead, Inspector Gregory Callahan, the same man who had led the descent 26 years earlier. No one knows where he had been in those missing decades. His handwriting, once measured and clear, now sprawled unevenly across the pages, its ink pressed deep into the paper as though written in a tremor. The report was never submitted through official channels. It was found instead in 1902, sealed within a steel case beneath the floorboards of an abandoned boarding house in Harrisburg. The opening page reads like a confession. "I have seen the shape beneath Daquan, and it is not the work of man. We built our pyramids to reach the heavens, but this was carved downward to hold something that should not rise." He described the chamber as larger than before and alive with vibration. The walls, he wrote, seemed to shift when unobserved, the angles bending as though they were breathing. He noted a faint metallic resonance in the air, a low tone that moved between frequencies faster than the human ear could perceive. It vibrated through his ribs, matching the rhythm of his own pulse, until he could no longer tell which belonged to him. "Faces in the angles," he wrote, Not carved, not reflections, but living facets of geometry. They move when I look away. They learn the shape of thought. Callahan's team, 12 men in all, began to experience confusion, misplaced hours, and unfinished sentences. They had moments of blindness in which they swore they saw the chamber from above, as though standing inside its reflection. One soldier began to scream that the light from his lantern had turned inside out, illuminating dark nests instead of stone. 3 of them vanished overnight. Their bedrolls were untouched and their boots neatly arranged. The ground beneath their tents was warm to the touch. By the end of his journal, Callahan's sentences fragment into shorter lines, almost poetic, as if language itself were failing him. It was meant to contain. It is beginning to fail. The breath of the earth grows quicker. The shape remembers us. The final entry ends abruptly. Below his signature is a smudge of ash, fingerprint-shaped, pressed into the paper. The ink surrounding it is scorched. The remaining pages are blank until the very last, where faint indentations reveal words written with a pen long since dry. Do not open it again. If you hear the hum beneath your feet, you are already standing in its shadow. The steel case holding his report was found warped inward, its edges fused as though melted from the outside. When archivists opened it, the air inside was warm, impossibly so, considering the century that had passed. Callahan was never found. His name, once struck from government record, was later re-added under a new heading, presumed active. To this day, the signature at the bottom of that report glows faintly under lamplight, as if the ink still remembers being written. In the spring of 1903, a memorandum quietly circulated through the Bureau of Geological Survey in Washington, D.C. It bore no title, no author, and no seal of approval, only a red wax stamp marked for internal reference. Inside were 7 pages of fragmented correspondence, all referring to what they called Containment Site 3, Daquan, Pennsylvania. The report was never meant for public record. Each line was written in the dry administrative tone of government work, yet the language betrays unease. Localized magnetic distortion persists, one paragraph reads, and structural symmetry maintains without measurable decay. Another states, recommend site remains sealed. Comparative analysis indicates similar subsurface formations in Kansas and Northern California. 3 other containment sites were mentioned with no addresses or coordinates, each one redacted with thick black ink. The archivist who later catalogued the report noted something peculiar about its formatting. The paper had been typed on 2 different machines, one standard for the era, another unknown. Its typeface was impossibly precise, the letters carved too deep, as if etched rather than struck. When light passed across the page, the indentations formed faint triangular patterns invisible from above. Among the attachments was a single photograph, a grainy aerial image of the Daquan Valley taken from a military balloon. The landscape appeared unremarkable at first glance, a patchwork of fields and narrow roads, until the eye adjusted. Beneath the pale crop lines, an enormous geometric depression stretched for nearly half a mile, faint but unmistakable, a triangle inverted, its edges too straight to be natural. No one in the department claimed authorship of the report. Those who handled it later described a mild vibration through the paper as though it retained a memory of the ground from which it came. One archivist, Helen Dray, wrote in her personal log that she suffered recurring headaches after reviewing the files. Her final entry, dated May 9, 1903, reads, "The pattern prints itself even through gloves." That summer, a classified directive was issued ordering the permanent stabilization of the Daquan site. Local records show the sudden construction of a new water reservoir in the valley, a convenient public works project built directly atop the old mine. Photographs of its foundation revealed that the concrete was poured in a triangular mold. Engineers claimed the shape distributed pressure evenly, yet the design has never appeared in any other American dam. Within the Bureau, Rumors spread that the report's original author was Callahan himself, though he would have been nearly 80 years old. The signature on the final page was unreadable, consisting only of 3 lines intersecting at a single downward point. The official archive lists the Daquan file as closed in 1903. Yet, one copy remained unsealed. Decades later, when the box was reopened for cataloguing, the paper inside had turned black and the ink reversed to white, as if the document itself had been photographed from within. Those who examined it described the same faint pulse through the pages, rhythmic, deliberate, and alive. No one has handled it since. In the summer of 1942, the United States Geological Survey commissioned a series of aerial photographs across Pennsylvania. The purpose was routine, mapping mineral deposits for wartime production. When the photographs of Carbon County arrived at the Department of Mines, the technician who developed them, Walter Briggs, noticed something that did not belong. At first, it appeared as a shallow depression in the valley north of the town once called Daquan. But when the images were placed side by side, taken at 5-minute intervals, the shape began to reveal itself. It was no ordinary sinkhole. The edges were exact, forming a triangle nearly half a mile wide, its lines straight enough to cut the horizon. And strangest of all, it had not been there in the images from just the year before. Briggs brought the negatives to his supervisor, who dismissed them as camera distortion. Yet, when the films were examined under magnification, faint striations appeared within the triangle, concentric layers, each smaller and repeating downward. Like steps carved into shadow, Briggs wrote in a private memo. A reconnaissance plane was sent to verify the anomaly. The pilot, Captain Dean Morrissey, later testified that his compass spun continuously as the aircraft passed over the valley. Radio communication cut in and out, replaced by a steady, rhythmic tone, the same pattern recorded in 1871 by Callahan's men, though none aboard could have known that. The captain's log includes the line, "It was as if something beneath us was speaking in pulses." The photographs were classified immediately. Analysts at Wright Field attempted to overlay them with earlier survey maps, but discovered discrepancies in scale. The valley itself appeared to have shifted by several degrees. The cartographers assumed a measurement error until they noticed that local landmarks, roads, fences, even the creek, had subtly bent around the depression, curving as if drawn toward its center. In October of that year, the Army Corps dispatched a small ground team under the guise of geological assessment. Locals remembered the trucks arriving at night, their headlights blacked out and their engines muffled. The men carried portable seismographs and left before dawn. No official report from that expedition survives, but a maintenance worker at the State Archive later claimed to have read a single page that escaped destruction. It described magnetic and acoustic interference consistent with low-frequency oscillation and ended with a brief handwritten note. The compass fails again. The ground is breathing. After 1942, the valley was fenced off and labeled a restricted testing zone. No flights were permitted below 3,000 feet. When the reservoir water receded during the drought of 1943, farmers reported seeing a faint glimmer under the surface, like polished stone catching the moonlight. By morning, it was gone. Briggs left government service that same year. Before his death in 1972, he told a reporter that he still saw the images in his sleep. "It wasn't a shadow," he said. "It was a window." He did not finish the sentence. The tape of that interview ends with a low, steady hum that no technician has ever been able to remove. The official record lists the anomaly as topographical distortion due to lens defect, but those who have viewed the surviving photographs agree on one detail. The triangle's lines were too perfect and its center too dark. It looked less like an absence, they said, and more like an opening. By the time the century turned, there was no Daquan on any map of Pennsylvania. The roads that once led to it ended in forest. Locals from neighboring towns spoke of an old mining settlement that had drowned, though no river ran through the valley. If one looked hard enough, they could find the faint trace of a causeway beneath the weeds, a road that led nowhere, splitting in the shape of a downward point. The government called the area a conservation zone. Survey records listed it as uninhabited terrain, unsuitable for agriculture. Yet in aerial photos taken decades apart, the forest canopy always appeared slightly different. Trees bending inward and shadows aligning at impossible angles, forming a faint geometric pattern that only emerged when the images were laid atop one another. In 1979, a group of geology students from Philadelphia University stumbled upon the perimeter fence while conducting field research. The sign read, "Federal property, do not enter." Though no agency was specified, one of the students, Michael Reed, ignored the warning. He followed the slope down through the trees and found the ground changing underfoot, the soil growing darker, smoother, and almost metallic. Then came the sound, a vibration so low it barely reached the ear, yet strong enough to make his teeth ache. Reed described what he saw in a single notebook page recovered after his disappearance. "The earth isn't solid here. It's moving, slow and deliberate, like something turning in its sleep. Beneath the moss are seams, 3 of them meeting in a perfect point. They lead down. I think there's still a chamber below." 2 days later, the remaining students returned to the site with local authorities. There was no sign of Reed, no footprints, and no disturbed soil, only his notebook and his camera, both lying beside a shallow depression in the shape of a triangle. The final photograph on his roll shows the forest canopy bending inward toward the lens as though drawn by invisible gravity. The negatives warped in storage, the image melting into a black spiral. In 1994, a private survey drone captured a thermal image of the valley while mapping nearby fault lines. The data showed a perfect geometric void beneath the surface, colder than the surrounding Earth and expanding fraction by fraction each year. Engineers dismissed it as equipment error, yet one technician named Grace Holloway sent an anonymous letter to the Harrisburg Tribune. It was never published, but a copy survives in the state archive. "They paved over something alive. The reservoir was built to drown it, but it's still there, still breathing, and the ground above it moves, though only when no one is watching." Today, the valley is known to hikers as the Hollow Forest, an empty patch of green between counties. No one lives within 5 miles of it. Compasses still fail near the ridge. Birds avoid flying directly overhead, and in the rare satellite photos taken during drought years, a faint triangular scar can be seen beneath the surface of the earth, darker than the soil around it, a shadow of perfect proportion. There are no graves, no records, and no mention of Daquan in official history. It is as if the town never existed. But some nights, when the wind is still and the valley air carries no sound, the ground vibrates with the faintest hum, steady, patient, and familiar. Perhaps pyramids were never meant to reach the sky. Perhaps they were built to hold the earth down.